Hello, everyone, and welcome today to our podcast of the Balancing Act from Security Compass. Threat modeling is a critical part of securing our software. We all know that. And it's through threat modeling that we are able to identify our threats, recommend mitigations, reduce the likelihood of an attack. But the challenge is, how do we construct such a program? Where does the value come from? How do we engage our developers? And to talk about these things, joining us today is Krish Raja, who works at Kroll. And Krish, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. Thanks so much, Altaz, for having me. Happy to participate. I started actually as a software developer after graduating from university. My first 3 years were spent at IBM as a developer, working primarily as a Java developer, building a Java Enterprise Edition systems. And I did that for about 3 years before I actually stepped into the world of cybersecurity, doing so at Security Compass. So I had actually graduated with Rohit Sethi, who is the current CEO at Security Compass, and after 3 years doing development, stepped into this brave new world of cybersecurity at a consulting firm that was only 6 people. I was the sixth person to join, and the benefit of joining a company of that size, if you can sort of stomach maybe the risks of doing so, is that you have a lot of opportunity. And so I was wearing many different hats for many years, working as a consultant, primarily on the offensive security side. So doing a lot of penetration testing, but also a lot of instructor-led training and code reviews and some elements of research as we tried to build our own methodology from a fledgling company. And I spent 8 years as a consultant executing a lot of these projects for different clients in Canada and the United States. With my background in development, I leaned a little bit more towards the application security side. That was a bit more of my strengths rather than on, let's say, the infrastructure side or other domains of security. And I did get the privilege of being involved with some application security programs for some larger financial institutions, both in Canada and the United States, and learned a lot from being a part of those initiatives. So that was a really valuable experience for my career. And after about 8 years as a consultant, I stepped into more of the leadership style. So led members of a team for 3 years as a director. And then the last 4 years, I would say, since transitioning over to Kroll, I've been in a managing director role. So I would have some leaders report to me, and we execute a lot of the strategy for our practice and our firm. And so while I'm not involved in the day-to-day execution, I certainly oversee some elements of that and get to collaborate and speak to a lot of people who try to execute a lot of these initiatives from the offensive side, but also a little bit on the defensive side.
That's great. It sounds like you've got a wealth of experience, and I think it's something that our listeners would be very interested in, and maybe we can just dive right into this, Krish. I mean, we talk about threat modeling, and there's a group of people that construct these threat models, and we're trying to identify potential attacks through certain vulnerabilities that exist. But let me just back up a second. How can we get threat modelers to help our developers? What are some things that threat modelers can do to help bridge the gap between understanding things from an attacker's perspective or from a defensive perspective, translating that into a group that works on a day-to-day basis with code?
So I think it's interesting because we're taking people on both sides who are highly technical. And usually the glue that I find that really helps in these situations is a degree of empathy. I think understanding that if you're primarily a consultant, let's say, in the offensive or defensive security domain, you're usually not the core implementer. You're trying to drive things forward, but you really need to rely on other people to do that level of implementation. So from my perspective, I found that the more I understood what the day-to-day tasks are of, let's say, a developer or an architect or a scrum master or somebody else who are building these systems looks like, the more that I can translate things that I think need to be done with respect to threat modeling into actionable items for them to execute, and for them to find value in doing so. I think there's lots of charts and graphs and directives that are meaningful that people try to elicit over the years, where you can present statistics that show how much more costly it is to fix things after the fact. And I don't think anyone disagrees with those things. But instead, if you can translate that more towards when you're building your systems this way, and this is how your sprint cycles look like and how they work, and here's how I can sort of step in to fill those gaps and when I can actually do threat modeling, I think that's where people will be able to absorb that more into their routine, and that can actually help them out a little bit more.
Yeah, it's interesting, really stepping into the day-to-day activities of a team that works in, for example, stories. If it's an agile team, how do we deconstruct the recommendations, countermeasures, and mitigations that we're recommending? Put that in a format that is digestible to them from a day-to-day perspective. It's interesting to watch how teams are beginning to do that now and to build that bridge as you were describing. Um, you're now really looking at things from a program perspective in your role today, Krish. If you were to look at value creation of a threat modeling program, how how do you go about arguing for the fact that threat modeling is in fact important to the business and it will create value? If that's the question that comes up, and it often does, how do we go about constructing a good argument for why threat modeling is good?
That's a great question, because I think on the surface, people probably understand that it comes down to cost and how it can save you costs in the long run for a little bit of upfront investment. But the challenge, and that's not specific to threat modeling, but it's like anything that you're introducing that might be new or on top of something that you're already doing, is making that upfront investment. It's even just like training people, so that you're not a single point of failure. You have to make that investment up front to train the person and know that things will get a little bit heavier uh, before they get a little bit lighter. So I think most people understand that if we're hiring somebody because we're short of capacity, no matter what kind of team it is, whether it's developers, consultants, marketing, sales, you might need more people because that's a good thing. You have a lot more to do and your existing team can't handle it. People intrinsically know that that means these people may not come with the same experience, well, certainly wouldn't come with the exact same experience that you have. But you need to invest that time into training them for those longer term gains. And I think it's something similar on the threat modeling side. I think the interesting thing about threat modeling too is that when you're on the offense or on the defense, if I just take offense as an example, people actually do threat modeling all the time. It's just that they're not necessarily formalizing the process. You're used to, as an attacker, building these threats. Maybe they're just in your mind. Maybe you're just taking notes into OneNote or Notepad or something else for things that you're going to try out later as you're doing an assessment. And so you're already actually doing the work. But what you're able to do with an element of threat modeling is to do a bit of knowledge sharing so that other people understand what you're going to be looking at as an attacker's perspective. And then those people can review those, and on the development side, possibly translate those into defense. Okay, if I know that that's what people are going to, often the first 5 things that they're going to try to do to attack a system that I've built, I can translate that into defense that I can build. And so we all know that building in your defensive capability from the start is what's going to save you in the long term. I think it's just a matter of identifying how you can do that in fashions such as this that'll really help make that a bit more of a reality.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so there are, in my experience, we've got communities like OpenSSF, Linux Foundation. They're doing some great work in this. Oasis Open is doing some work around this as well to try and help us to bridge the gap, and really through that determine how we can create value as it comes to aligning with what the business needs are. And it's going to be different for each organization, right? For some, speed to market is going to be extremely important. And then there will be others where they really need to take a look at legacy investments. And so some of the work that's being done at the Open Group around zero trust, for example, starts to come in. And these are all tied in together, as you said, Krish. We are talking about threat modeling, but there are ways to go out there and to gather this information from a number of different sources. But the work is being done, even though it may not be formally called a threat modeling program, for example. Um, in your opinion, when you've observed organizations, teams that are trying to create a threat modeling program, um, what have you seen as the common pitfalls? Any pearls of wisdom for our listeners that they should watch out for?
I think, based on my experience, and perhaps a lot of people can relate to this. A lot of times we try to be perfectionists, especially if it's something where you're tasked with training others. Let's say in this case, in threat modeling. So you're trying to teach people how to do something, and then you might habitually move towards a perfect end-to-end process. If there are, let's say, 5 steps or 7 steps or 10 steps that you've identified in your experience on how to execute threat modeling successfully, your habit might be to define and document and train everybody on all of those 10 steps to ensure that you've got a thorough program and everybody's got a complete set of training. What I've found is, especially in today's world where there's such a emphasis on speed to market for good reason, I think the more you can build those things out iteratively is where you can start to see those gains much more quickly. I think things like threat modeling, in my world, a lot of times penetration testing as well, are seen as important, but also bottlenecks. And it's hard to fit those things in, and they don't necessarily always translate to the speed to market, right? And so if you're able to sort of build elements of steps and train people, but then bring them along your journey while you're building the rest, I think that's what's going to be more helpful to avoid those pitfalls of taking too long to get started. I think the faster you can actually get started with something, the more open people will be to be able to join you on that journey. Because I think a lot of times I've found that I've waited too long to get something started to make sure that I've worked out all of the kinks. And you'd be surprised at how pleased people might be to start with 2 steps instead of having all 5 of them ready. So they get a taste of what this is going to look like, and they'll actually give you some initial feedback, right? Stuff that you maybe could have applied to those first 2 steps rather than waiting until the end when they've seen all 5 steps. And now you're getting an insight into step 1 and step 2 that you maybe could have achieved earlier. So the sooner you can start with something that's good enough but not perfect, I think and make those expectations clear that this is an iterative process, I think the better you'll be in the long run.
Yeah, it's the incremental building rather than trying to force something that maybe is too big of a leap. Really taking more of an architectural approach and looking at it from the point of view of building the essential building blocks and the capabilities, and then emerging from there. Krish, where do you see threat modeling headed now in the future? We're seeing this convergence, or at least this empathy beginning to rise between threat modelers and developers, and but where do you see the practice of threat modeling headed? Any thoughts? Any ideas on that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because when I first started my career, I think it was a very tough sell for people to wrap their heads around threat modeling and adopting it into their practice, because it was a very paper-based exercise when I started. At least in the terms of putting it into a document, and you'd have documents out there that would capture these ideas and these threats. And now we're starting to see these become, let's say, integrated more into systems that people are using, where they can pull out requirements and pull out threats, and review these threats as well if you're building something in particular, and you can have them alongside, let's say, your user stories that you're building. So I think I think it's going to grow because of things like the software security framework, where these are governance policies that are highlighting the importance of doing things that can have you comply with some of these frameworks, number one. And then number two, I think the more we can automate elements of threat modeling, and companies that can help support you with those sorts of tools, that's just going to be a game changer. We're already seeing some tools out there that can help this, and I'm sure as the adoption of threat modeling grows, the need to update and upgrade those tools will similarly grow. And so that level of automation is going to be key to getting people on board with threat modeling.
That's wonderful. Krish, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. To our listeners, please do check us out for some additional podcasts at podcast.securitycompass.com. Have yourselves an excellent day.
Thanks so much, everyone.